take a look at our quarterback rankings and tiers. We're looking at the top 24. We're going pretty deep here with quarterback because this is a position that is just so much deeper than years past. There are more and more quarterbacks with high ceilings, decent rushing floors, guys that can just give you fantasy value, and you can get them late in drafts. So we are going to obviously start up at the top, talk about some of these players that are in the very top tier. We've updated these since our June quarterback rankings episode, and we're going to update them again in August, right before fantasy drafts. So, Dave, let's jump into this right now. Quarterback one, Josh Allen still reigns supreme there in our overall rankings on average. But last time we spoke, he was in a tier all by himself. And this time he is not in a tier all by himself. We've got a few other quarterbacks with him, but I do want to talk about Josh Allen first. And oh, you know what? No, let's talk about all three of them because I think this is the reason that Josh Allen's not in this tier anymore. Josh Allen at 1, Jalen Hurts at 2, and Lamar Jackson at 3. Now, Lamar Jackson is your quarterback 1, Dave. He is my quarterback 3. This now opens up this tier to having these 3 quarterbacks all with tremendous rushing upside. We've seen that they can have tremendous passing upside. What went into this, moving Lamar Jackson up to quarterback 1 and no longer having Josh Allen in this tier all by himself?
It was kind of looking at the change that happened mid-season for the Ravens. And, we talked about it a ton last offseason, like how Todd Monken was going to affect this Ravens offense. And if you look to start the season, it kind of looked like the same old Ravens team where they were really focusing on their tight ends and focusing on their running backs. And Zay Flowers was getting some deep shots here and there that he wasn't able to connect with Lamar Jackson on. And it was like, wow, this Ravens team looks a lot like the Ravens team that we've watched for the last few years. But then I looked a little bit deeper, and it was around week 12 that we saw the Todd Monken offense kind of start to take effect in Baltimore a little bit. And that's when we saw huge progressions from Lamar Jackson as a passer. And that's what we had hoped for. And if you look at the whole season as a whole, you don't really see that. But from week 12 onward, Lamar Jackson was averaging 31 pass attempts per game. He was on pace for over 4,200 passing yards. So we know the rushing upside is there. Like the rushing hardly changed at all. He was still rushing at an elite rate, but it was that step forward that he took as a passer and that we saw in passing volume that really got me excited. I mean, if you look from week 12 onward and through the playoffs, Lamar Jackson was pacing for 4,200 passing yards and 972 rushing yards. If he's able to maintain that pace over a full season, he's absolutely going to finish as the QB1. So on top of that, it's not that I'm down dramatically on Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, but I think that when you start looking at the improved pass catchers, Mark Andrews being back there, Zay Flowers expected to take a step forward, and then you look at the struggles that Philly had in the second half of last year, you look at the losses that the Buffalo Bills have had, I just feel like Lamar Jackson is the safest and also has the highest ceiling of the bunch, but really we're splitting hairs. Like all 3 of these guys are very, very, very close.
Yeah, I think why I still keep Josh Allen up at quarterback 1 is because we saw him maintain his production even when Joe Brady became offensive coordinator and there was this big rift in the time space continuum that is the Buffalo Bills, and Stephon Diggs all of a sudden couldn't play football anymore or whatever it was. I mean, he was still, we were looking at the weeks, quarterback 5, quarterback 1, quarterback 9, 17, 2, 6, 4, and the rushing actually went up. And I don't know if that's just him playing his hero ball like he does, but we do tend to see that with quarterbacks. And I mentioned that with Justin Herbert a few weeks back, is that when the quarterback does not have their reliable targets they've had in the past, they will just resort to running. And I think that's kind of the good thing with all 3 of these guys here is that, listen, we want to hope that they are going to have these fantastic targets, whether it's Dalton Kincaid for Josh Allen or it's AJ Brown and Devontae Smith for Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson as Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers. But even when they don't, that rushing upside is still there, and it gives them just such an incomparable fantasy floor that I don't know that anyone else matches. So I do think we have these guys correctly ranked in their own tier altogether.
Yeah, and then the last thing I'll mention, I mean, like I said, it was, about the midway point of the season was 1, when we saw Todd Monken's offense take effect, and 2, when we saw Joe Brady take over as the offensive coordinator. And from week 11 onward, Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen were tied with 25.0
Yep.
points per game. So, I mean, I don't think you can go wrong with either of these guys. Obviously, we know the upside with Jalen Hurts. Um, Jalen Hurts is my QB3. I've got him behind these other two just because of the concerns about the loss of Jason Kelsey and can he maintain his rushing touchdown production? We'll find that out very quickly, and maybe I'm a fool for being a little bit lower on Jalen Hurts, but these top three, you can't go wrong with any of them.
I mean, lower, like you're one spot lower. You went from quarterback
Right.
2 to
Yeah.
quarterback 3. It's not
Right.
it's not crazy before anyone clutches their pearls here. All right. Before we move on to our next tier, I just want to remind everybody you've got tons of ways that you can enjoy the show. You can either listen on our audio version, the podcast, which has an extra 10 to 15 minutes of bonus content at the beginning where we get into some more deeper conversation there. So make sure you subscribe to that. We've got the link in the description down below. And then also our YouTube channel. If you're watching here on YouTube, thanks for joining us. Make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the episode, drop a comment down below. Maybe you love these rankings, you hate these rankings, you'd move someone higher or lower, whatever it may be. But also, there's another reason you should be commenting. We have got a giveaway that we are doing. It is our Listener League giveaway. These have been really fun to just throw in these secret phrases in here. It got you guys saying that you really like Arthur Smith and saying avoid the landmines. And then there's people that are just using these secret phrases in really creative ways. So this time, for a spot in the show's Listener League, you're going to comment below with the secret phrase, I like late round quarterbacks. All right. There it is. I like late round quarterbacks. Make sure you comment with that. All right, Div. Let's go to our next tier where we've got, once again, just 3 quarterbacks. And it's guys that I think all have some decent rushing upside. And I think we just have a few more questions about them. It's weird to say that there's questions about Patrick Mahomes at
Yeah.
quarterback 4 here. But I think it's just both of us can kind of look at him and say, he hasn't been that quarterback 1 or 2 overall as often as some of these other quarterbacks that are ahead of him, like Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. We like that there are better weapons on this team. I dropped him from quarterback 3 to 4. You dropped him from quarterback 4 to 5. So he still averages out as our quarterback 4 overall. I think it just comes down to the rushing upside is better with some of those other players, and we don't know what's going to be happening with this wide receiver core. But Dave, I do want to ask here, some of the other quarterbacks that we have in this tier, Anthony Richardson and Kyler Murray at 5 and 6. You have Patrick Mahomes ranked behind Anthony Richardson. So why are we going with that? Is it simply the rushing upside? Because Mahomes should have better receivers, and we've seen him do it where he's a top 4 quarterback 4 out of the last 6 years. Anthony Richardson, I am getting worried. I think that we were all so excited, and I still am. And I think the potential is still there. But it's almost kind of like when everyone's in on it, I'm starting to get out on it. I'm getting nervous. I'm getting anxious. So seeing you put him ahead of Patrick Mahomes now, I'm getting nervous.
Yeah, I get it. And there's reason for concern here. I'm trying to pull it up right now. I recently went back and looked at like what Anthony Richardson did on a per drop back basis. And if he is able to replicate that and the team is able to maintain the same pace of play that they had from last year and maintain the same run pass ratio that they had last year, Anthony Richardson's going to break fantasy football. Like his efficiency last year, the pace of play, and the run pass ratio from last year, if you put that all together over a 17 game season, Anthony Richardson would smash the record that Lamar Jackson set in 2019. So that's just the upside case for Anthony Richardson is what is so alluring here. Now with Patrick Mahomes, obviously you know what you're getting. We talked about him as one of the safest players you could draft just a couple of weeks ago on this channel, where every single year he has been either as good as the number 1 overall quarterback or as bad as the number 9 overall quarterback and doesn't fall outside of that range. So you're getting basically guaranteed QB1 production with overall QB1 upside. But if he hits that, super high end range of outcomes that Patrick Mahomes has, you're going to be happy with the 25, 20 or 24 or 25 points per game that you get. But Anthony Richardson is a guy that if he hits his high end range of outcomes, you could be looking at 28, 29, 30 points per game, giving you like a 4 to 5 point advantage over every other quarterback.
Is there a reason why it's him moving up so high over a guy like Kyler Murray, who you've got at quarterback 6, who's also got some rushing upside and some added weapons? Or is it just that, hey, we saw in that small sample size that Anthony Richardson did it?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, we did see Anthony Richardson did it on a per dropback basis. He was like the most efficient quarterback that we've ever seen from a fantasy football standpoint. Kyler Murray, we know what he is as well. Every single year, he finishes somewhere between like QB 3 and QB 10, and you know that you're getting that from him. I still think that there's upside with Kyler Murray. I just don't know if he has that game breaking upside that Anthony Richardson possesses.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So that's our tier number 2. We've got Patrick Mahomes at 4, Anthony Richardson at 5, Kyler Murray at 6, which I think would surprise a lot of people. We both moved Kyler up 2 spots from quarterback 8 where he was before. And I think this next tier, tier 3, is where we might start to upset some people.
Let me ask
Yes,
real quickly. Last time we did the show, was it before or after the draft? Do you remember?
it was after the
Last
draft. We did
last
this.
time we
We
did
did
our
this
rankings?
in yeah. We did this in June. Our very first episode on this new channel was ranking the rookies after they got
Oh,
drafted.
alright. Yeah.
So yeah, like there's not a whole lot has changed. Just we've dived,
Divvied.
doved,
Yeah.
divded
Yeah,
English.
but I
Uh,
think what it is, like with Kyler Murray, like the Cardinals have just had such a great offseason.
yeah,
Obviously landing Marvin Harrison Jr., beefed up the offensive line, Trey Benson, Zay Jones, like they've made some good additions to that team. And maybe that's it, that it's just like marinated a bit over the
yeah.
last couple of months. And like it's really kind of soaked in how good the offseason has been for the Cardinals. And then also kind of looking at the guys going, I think you and I both did the same thing where we moved Kyler ahead of the same two guys. And I'm thinking we'll probably discuss why pretty soon.
Yeah. In this next tier, I think this is where we start to see some of the more immobile quarterbacks. And it's not that they're not good. It's that it really seems like the scoring threshold, whether we want to put that as the upside or the floor, seem to all be very similar. This next tier, tier number 3, starts with Joe Burrow at quarterback 7. At 8, we've got CJ Stroud. At 9, it's Dak Prescott. 10, Jordan Love. And at 11, it's Jayden Daniels. Now, we talked plenty about CJ Stroud on our last episode that we did, and I think I put together some fairly comprehensive points as to why I'd rather not take CJ Stroud at his current ADP, and I think that this is a much more accurate reflection of where he should be ranked, around quarterback 8 instead of the current quarterback 5 average draft position that he has. Joe Burrow is a guy that I think you can make the case for him being in the tier above, but there's not that rushing upside, Dave, that we see with guys like Kyler Murray, Anthony Richardson, and we haven't really seen Joe Burrow be all that consistently healthy. I hate to lean on that too much, but it is
Yeah.
one of those intangible things that just it creeps into your brain and you can't do anything about it.
There you go. Alfredo Brown calling Joe Burrow soft. Would you say that to his face, Alfredo? I'm I'm giving you a
No,
hard
because
time.
I'm soft. I'm really soft. I would never say that to his face.
Yeah.
I would never say that to
I
anyone's
I will
face.
say, I think both injuries that he has sustained are kind of fluky injuries, like the ACL and then that thumb wrist injury, whatever it was, like that just seems like such a fluke. Like it's not like he's one
Well,
of
he
those
had the
guys that's like,
calf thing too to start out
oh
the
yeah,
season, and the
good point.
Bengals have
Forgot
had
about that
2
one. Yeah,
back-to-back seasons where, like, the first 3 or 4 games were rough, and so I think,
you're right.
at
Yeah.
least for me, it becomes that mental roadblock where we've seen enough of that where you're like, "Oh, Joe Burrow is human."
Yeah.
Right? And you start to you almost have to incorporate that intangible part into the ranking a little bit where you're like, he can miss time or he can play poorly. And there's games where he's getting single digit numbers for you. You know the upside is there. You know the Bengals offense can be phenomenal. But I think we kind of already saw a worst case scenario for guys like Kyler
Mhm.
and Patrick Mahomes. And we've seen, okay, like it's not bad. But worst case for Joe Burrow looks pretty bad.
Yeah. And looking at this tier again, we talked about, in the audio portion when we open up this show. This won't be on YouTube, but if you want to go check out the podcast version where we kind of talk about like the theory behind how we rank and how we do things, and we talked about how like ADP and consensus rankings absolutely bleed into our process a little bit, and as we're doing drafts, like even if we don't want it to, like it just subconsciously will leak into our process. And when I look at this tier, I almost can't help but feel like I have it like upside down. Like I've got Joe Burrow, CJ Stroud, Dak Prescott, Jayden Daniels, Jordan Love, but it almost feels like, if I wasn't looking at ADP and I wasn't looking at consensus rankings, Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud should probably be a little bit lower. Like, we know how high the ceiling is for Dak Prescott. We saw Jordan Love over the final third of the season and through the playoffs looking like one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And he's got some legs too that can raise his floor and ceiling. And then Jayden Daniels with the unknown there. I mean, he's another guy, much like Anthony Richardson, who we talked about, that can break fantasy football. Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud are both safe quarterbacks. Like, they're going to throw for 4,000 yards, but in order for them to, outperform their ADP, we're going to need insane touchdown efficiency where these guys are throwing for 40 plus touchdowns. And it's really hard to expect that. It's much easier to expect a player like Jordan Love or Jayden Daniels to rush and raise that floor and ceiling. So I find myself all the time in drafts just passing on Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud, knowing that I can get Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, Jayden Daniels later in drafts. I just don't really have it in me to reflect that in my rankings. But, as we're sitting here talking through it and, putting a fine tooth comb through these rankings, like, I almost want to say that I would prefer Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, and Jay Daniels ahead of Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud, as crazy as that may sound.
So I think there's an important distinction to make, and I want to confirm this with you before we keep going, because saying that we, or at least I know I prefer Prescott, Love, and Daniels at cost over Burrow and Stroud. If the cost was the same across the board and I could get all five of these quarterbacks in round 7, I would rank them the way I have them, which is Burrow, Stroud, Prescott, Love,
Mhm.
Daniels.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes, whether it's the opinions that we formulate for our drafts, the rankings we make, whatever it is, we do let the value of ADP start to pull these players down in rankings when that's not what rankings are. It should be,
Right.
if everything was equal in cost, who would you prefer? And so, speak on that a little bit, Dave, because I want to confirm, like, that's where we are. Would you genuinely take a guy like Jayden Daniels or Jordan Love and Dak over Burrow and Stroud if cost was the exact same?
I mean, I think I might. I think I might, as
Okay.
crazy as that sounds. I don't like,
Okay.
Jordan Love last year was the QB5, and that was with
Yeah.
a stretch in the middle of the season where he was pretty bad. I mean, he has a high ceiling and a high floor every single week. Um, CJ Stroud was healthy all year, and I mean, missed a couple games towards the end of the season, but I'm looking right now, like, he just finishes the QB 11. Like, he
Yep.
didn't have that same ceiling.
I think the excitement is that people believe he's going to take that step. The addition of Stephon Diggs, the addition
Of
of Joe
course, yeah,
Mixon, CJ Stroud should only be getting better, right? Like, that's how it works. That's how it works in Madden. They go
yeah.
up a couple of progression points and get some more XP. Like, that's life.
I don't know, man. I might be making a ranking switch live on this show right now. Dak Prescott last year averaged almost 21 points per game. Meanwhile, Joe Burrow was nowhere close. Obviously, injury, we know that. CJ Stroud, well behind him as well. Jordan Love. But, like, Dak Prescott and Jordan Love outscored these guys just last year. And now we're still ranking them ahead because we know that they're better passers. But I don't know. I feel like maybe we do have this one wrong. I feel like, and you just talked about Dak Prescott as like being one of your favorite,
I was going to
uh,
mention that. Yep.
what
It's
what
one of
what
our
episode
safe.
was that?
It
I
was,
can't
yeah, that
remember.
was the
Safest players?
safest players to draft, and he is, like, that's why he's still QB9 for me. And
It's not just
the
safety, it's a ceiling too. Like, we've seen this guy
yeah,
finish as the overall QB1.
QB2.
He was the overall QB3 last year. Like, I don't know. I'm doing it. I'm doing it right now, live on the show. I'm moving Dak
All
Prescott up
right.
ahead of Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud. So, whatever graphics we made from this show are gonna be outdated. Dak Prescott is my QB7. Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud are my QB8 and QB9. You just saw it here
Thanks a
live on the
lot, Dave.
show, updated on footballguys.com.
The guy who's just after them, who I wanted to talk about a bit here because we haven't talked much about him after being, I don't want to say all in on Jordan Love and the Packers last year, but we loved the upside that came with his draft cost. Like you said, Jordan Love, he's got the rushing ability. We saw the passing ability. Quarterback 5 last year in fantasy points, 11 finishes as a fantasy QB1, so top 12. The floor was phenomenal. He only had 2 games outside of the top 18 quarterbacks in fantasy. So this was another guy who, very similarly to Dak, was very safe every week when you started him. He had upside to win you your week. And among the starting quarterbacks going into 2024, Jordan Love was actually 8th in rushing yards and tied for 4th in rushing touchdowns. Like, this is,
Mhm.
it's one of those things, we talked about it in the live stream that we did for the best ball live stream. Go check that out, youtube.com/@football guys fantasy. that if we all love Christian Watson and Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks, and we're starting to steam up all these different Romeo Doubs, sure, whatever, Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft, and we start steaming up all these different Packers weapons,
I won't
maybe
let you get by without mentioning Bo Melton.
yeah, whatever. Um, you just maybe you just don't draft any of them and you take Jordan Love, so you reap all the benefits without having to incur this crazy draft cost. So are we overlooking his upside because this is a guy that we both have comfortably ranked? I have him at quarterback 10. You've got him at quarterback 11 behind Jayden Daniels, which is saucy of you. But are we overlooking the upside for Jordan Love? Because I think there is still some pretty genuine rushing and passing upside that's yet to be unlocked.
Yeah, and first, I just want to say with like the wide receivers, I think that's just like a classic case of projections versus rankings. Like,
Right.
if like projections aren't going to have four wide receivers going inside the top 11 rounds, but rankings do, and ADP does because it's like, what if Dontavian Wicks is the wide receiver one? What if Christian Watson is the wide receiver one? And it's like every drafter has kind of clung on to one of these four receivers, saying, what if they can be the guy? They reach for that guy. And then before you know it, all four wide receivers, Reed, Dubs, Watson, and Wicks, are all a little bit overvalued because everybody has planted a flag on one of those guys. So projections are going to be a lot lower on those four wide receivers than rankings will be on those four wide receivers. But it is kind of funny that, like, so much of the concern with Jaden or Jordan Love, and you hear this all the time, is like, well, now everybody's going to have a year of film on him. He might slow down, he might regress going into next year. But meanwhile, we're putting CJ Stroud, who everybody also has a year of film on now and is going into his next year. We're putting him comfortably ahead of Jordan Love. When these guys, I think, should be a lot tighter in ADP. And Jordan Love has some rushing upside that CJ Stroud doesn't. So this is another one where, like, maybe I'm just ranking this way because this is how ADP is and I feel like I should, but I could make a strong case to put Jordan Love ahead of CJ Stroud.
I actually love that side by side, and it goes back to what you talked about in the audio version just before we switched over to YouTube here is, you go back and you look at what happened last year and try to learn from the mistakes. And when you put these two quarterbacks side by side and you're saying, okay, Jordan Love was the quarterback 5 and CJ Stroud was, what was it, quarterback 10 or 11?
11. Yeah.
CJ Stroud. And, the whole thing is CJ Stroud should get better in his second season. And CJ Stroud got a new weapon with Stephon Diggs. Well, Jordan Love is going into what's now going to be his second season as a full starter, where he should get better with more reps. And in a way, he's getting a new wide receiver back with Christian Watson, who he really didn't get a full season with. Now, I'm not going to say that it's a 1-for-1 exact same thing, but a lot of the same reasons, just like you said, Dave, a lot of the same reasons that we like CJ Stroud, we should be liking Jordan Love. So I wouldn't be surprised if we come back to this episode in August, our quarterback rankings episode, and we have CJ Stroud at quarterback 10 or 11, exactly where
Mhm.
he finished last year. And it's going to become something where you and I are almost completely out on him at draft cost.
And I think another big part of this, especially this time of year, almost all of the data going into ADP is in best ball. Like right now, people aren't drafting on Yahoo and ESPN and CBS and NFL Network and Sleeper. They're drafting on Underdog and they're drafting on Drafters, where stacking is so important. And we talked about it, like all four of the wide receivers for Green Bay, yeah, they're probably a little overvalued, but still, like, Jayden Reed is the first wide receiver going off the board in Green Bay, and that's in round 5 or 6. And then you've got Dubs and Watson going rounds after that, and then you've got Dontavian Wicks going in round 11. So the difference with Houston is that Nico Collins is going in round 2. Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs are going in round 3 and 4. So then I think what happens is, because there have been 3 guys drafted from the Texans already, all 3 of those guys are worried about getting their CJ Stroud stack, so they probably reach for Stroud a little bit. Where with the Packers, it's a little bit different. You draft Jordan Love, and then you draft his wide receivers after. So you've got to wonder how much that bleeds into ADP as well, is that people are trying to stack these offenses and they have to reach for CJ Stroud to complete that stack, where they don't feel that same need for Jordan Love.
Let's take a stand right here. Average draft position does not equal rankings.
Yes.
And we need people to understand that. And we need to practice what we preach. All right, let's go to our next tier here, where honestly, right out the gate, I kind of feel like when I did this and I started to color code these and put the tiers, I think I did this incorrectly, Dave. And I think we have a chance here to correct this on air on the show. Brock Purdy is our quarterback 12, and he starts this new tier. And I think what I did was I said, there's not the same upside for Brock Purdy. But the difference is that he's got a better floor than all the rest of the quarterbacks in this tier. So let me just go through these quarterbacks first, and then we'll talk about Brock Purdy. So at 12, it's Brock Purdy. At 13, it's Caleb Williams. At 14, Tua Tagovailoa. At 15, Jared Goff. 16, Justin Herbert. And at 17, Trevor Lawrence. And so that is our tier number 4. Brock Purdy being at quarterback 12, we both have him at 12. I really believe there's a floor here that he has for fantasy. And I know like your whole thing that you're absolutely right is we don't play for floor. We don't play to get second and third place. We want the upside. There's also some pretty good upside here where we have quarterback 2 overall weeks from Brock Purdy. He was, let me see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks as a top 7 quarterback. So there is some decent ceiling there. Maybe not the same as some of these rushing guys, but there is this decent ceiling. There is a good offense. And I think there's a better floor than everyone else in this tier. So did I put this tier incorrectly? Does Brock Purdy deserve to go up a tier?
Potentially, yeah. I think so. I mean, he was a QB 6 overall last year and the per game QB 8. So like the production is there, and here we are ranking him outside of our top 12 or at QB 12.
He's
And
at
again,
QB
this
12.
just kind of yeah, this just kind of comes down to like talking about like QBs are kind of deep this year. Like all these guys that we're talking about, Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy, Jordan Love, we're all like top 10 quarterbacks last year that are being ranked outside of the top 10 going into next year. So I can't help but wonder with Purdy, like if he was even a round 2 pick. Like I'm not saying anything crazy. I'm not saying he's a top 10 pick or anything like that. Like if Brock Purdy had a little bit of draft capital instead of being, Mr. Irrelevant at the end of the draft, would we be viewing him the same way that we do right now? Because I think that there are still some concerns where he's not always putting the ball directly on the money. He might lack a little bit of an arm strength, but he's just so good in this offense. Like he's got it between the ears. He knows how to run the offense, and he's surrounded with playmakers that make his job easy. So I think a lot of the concerns maybe long term with Brock Purdy, like what'll he look like in an offense without George Kittle and without Debo Samuel and without Christian McCaffrey and without Kyle Shanahan? Those are the conversations that we have for Dynasty. And I think that those conversations are very warranted, and we should be having those discussions. But for 2024, he's got Kyle Shanahan, he's got Debo Samuel, he's got Christian McCaffrey, he's got George Kittle, he's probably going to have Brandon Ayuk. So maybe we shouldn't have any concerns about him, and we should just be ranking him exactly where he's finished in the last few years, which is inside the top 10.
Yeah, I mean, having him at quarterback 12, I think is perfectly fine for our rankings, but I think that he fits the exact mold that you want as being the last guy in a tier, right? And when we
Mhm.
look at that tier of players that we just talked about with Jordan Love and Dak and Stroud and Burrow, the name might not be as sexy, and I think a lot of us still we talk about the intangibles of fantasy football and the things that we just can't, use data with is like we keep looking back at the fact that Brock Purdy was Mr. Irrelevant and he was an MVP candidate at one point last season. Obviously, all
Mhm.
that came crumbling down, but uh, I think we can just finally admit like he's a good NFL quarterback. He gives you the fantasy production you need. I think that's enough there on Brock Purdy, but I think he fits exactly when you're looking for that last quarterback in a tier. That's what you would want. Let's go to our next guy. At 13, we both have Caleb Williams. This is a big jump for me, who I brought him up from quarterback 17 to quarterback 13, because I am starting to sip the Kool-Aid on this Bears offense being not just better, but like just phenomenally much improved. Grammar police, check me on that one. But Caleb
Phenomenally
Williams,
much improved.
yeah, shut up. Uh, you got 3 wide receivers with incredible talent. Caleb Williams does have the rushing upside that you've been talking about, Dave, and it's something that's been on film. And I almost wonder sometimes that rookies do this where they kind of look at their college play as a resume, especially when it's a guy like Caleb Williams, who he's going to be a top draft pick, where they almost do kind of like what Michael Jordan and LeBron James have tried to do, which is like, okay, what else can I add to my resume to help with my legacy?
Mhm.
And sports media has done this where players have to actually think about legacy. And I promise I'm going to land the plane on this. I'm not just going crazy here. It does not surprise me that Caleb Williams needed to think more about legacy and try to show that he can be a pocket passer and play within structure in his final season at USC. And he didn't run as much. And he didn't get the double digit rushing touchdowns. Excuse me, he did get the double digit bleh. He did get the double-digit rushing touchdowns in each of his final 2 seasons, but we didn't see it quite the same way where he had as much of a rushing floor like he did early on in his career at Oklahoma. And so what I wonder here, Dave, and so many people are going to comment this is like, how can you put a rookie in this tier? He's never played, and rookies don't do anything. Rookies do. There's a reason that we're putting Anthony Richardson as high as we are after playing like what 3-4 games,
Yeah.
because we can see what they can do in that small sample size. So does Caleb Williams actually have the highest fantasy ceiling out of this tier where we're looking at Purdy, Tua, Goff, Herbert, Lawrence? Is it Caleb that actually has the highest ceiling even as a rookie? I know I'm asking the Bears fan, but I think it's a reasonable question.
Yeah. I think maybe Herbert. Herbert might be the one guy that I'd say could have a higher ceiling because he has similar rushing output, and he's somebody that we've already seen throw for 4,000 yards in a season multiple times. So Justin Herbert is the one guy that I would say has like a similar ceiling to Caleb Williams. But yeah, I've talked about it a lot. I know you're kind of on board now. I heard James Coe just talking about it a few days ago as well. That like Caleb Williams is a very underrated rusher, and I think that we can see that. You know, not 1,000 yards, anything like that, but I think that we can see somewhere around 500 yards rushing, which would vastly improve his floor and ceiling. So, um,
It's
the
realistic.
thing is, we could also
442
see that.
rushing yards at Oklahoma as a freshman in 11 games.
Yeah, and
It's
and I think
realistic
the
to
thing
say
is,
it.
we could also realistically see that from Justin Herbert, who you talk about, so many schemed runs for quarterbacks in these Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh offenses that Justin Herbert also might have some untapped rushing potential in his game. So I think those are my two favorite guys in this tier. But Jared Goff is another guy that I find myself drafting quite a bit of. Like doesn't have the super immense high end ceiling. He's probably not going to finish as the overall quarterback one, but this guy since joining Detroit has just like solidly been a low end QB1. So I think that if you're
I think
drafting a
he's
guy like
right there with
Jayden
Brock
Daniels,
Purdy. Like, he's
right?
just a
Yeah,
step behind Brock Purdy. It's a very similar archetype in fantasy quarterback.
just so much cheaper. But like, yeah,
Yeah.
on a good offense, surrounded by great playmakers. So there are some of these guys that we're higher on in rankings. Anthony Richardson, Jayden Daniels, Caleb Williams. But I say all the time that if you're going to draft one of those guys that possesses a ton of risk, you want to pair them up with kind of a safer quarterback. And I think Goff is like the perfect QB2 if you do swing for the fences with your QB1.
So let's rehash this really quick. Brock Purdy at 12, Caleb Williams at 13, Tua Tagovailoa at 14, and I think that's correct. I went down a spot, you went up a spot. I think that's about right for what that offense can provide. He'll have some spike weeks there. Apparently, he's dropped some weight, looking to be a little more mobile, so that's nice.
Yeah.
Jared Goff gives you the good floor, but that Detroit Lions continues to have that Detroit Lions offense continues to have a great ceiling. Justin Herbert is the guy that we both actually dropped down to quarterback 16. We dropped him 2 spots, but it's funny because we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. Like we still say like there's the potential. I think that we can still say that there's potential and there's still upside, yet still move a player down in our rankings. So it's not necessarily speaking out of both sides of
I
our
think there
mouth.
was just
It's
I think the
speaking with
ranking
nuance.
with Justin Herbert was like us holding on to hope that like maybe they'll trade for a wide receiver one, or maybe they'll
Yeah.
sign, one of these RB1s off the street. And then what did they do? They brought in DJ Chark and Gus Edwards. And it's like, so that's how they're rolling into
All right.
2024, huh? Like maybe we should drop him a bit. And like the upside is undeniable, but the downside is also there.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have him there. And the last guy we've got in this tier is Trevor Lawrence.
Hmm.
And I find this interesting because I think many people could argue that he might have actually the highest ceiling out of this tier. We've actually seen him finish as the quarterback 8 in 2022. There is some rushing upside to Trevor Lawrence. They did lose some wide receivers, but then they also kind of revamped their wide receiver core. It's another year in the offense, understanding it. It's another year of actually he gets Christian Kirk back, who he didn't have last year for the entire time. So how high is the ceiling for Trevor Lawrence? Is he maybe the guy like I think there might be an argument that you could take him ahead of guys like Tua and Goff, but I do think that the floor for Trevor Lawrence might be the lowest out of everyone here, and I think that's what keeps us putting him at quarterback 17.
Yeah, and I mean he's a good quarterback. There's no way around it. But the fantasy production just hasn't really been there throughout his career. Like you said, like his best season was QB8, and then last year he was QB7, and I think last year he was dealing with, or I'm sorry, he was QB 17
I was
last
like,
year.
that sounds great.
Yeah. Best year was QB 8, except for last year when he was QB 7. No, he was QB 17 last year, and I think a lot of that, like his mobility was zapped because of the injuries. You know,
Yep.
he took some big hits last year, didn't look like himself in the second half of the season. I just don't know. I don't know. We
I'll
haven't
say this:
seen
the
it
back
ceiling so
half of the
far,
season looked better. The back half of the season
which is
looked
when he
much
was hurt.
better.
Weirdly enough,
Yeah, well,
that's when
so
he was
there's
dealing with those injuries.
yeah, I mean, there's a few games here where he was listed as probable because of the ankle
Mhm.
and the shoulder. Injury
I do
reports are
see
so
that though.
annoying.
32, 25, 25, 20. Like he went on a little stretch after week 11 where he was playing pretty good. Well, not playing pretty good football, but scoring a lot of fantasy points. Where early in the season when he was healthy, for some reason, he wasn't. Like he didn't have his first 20-point game until week 11.
So that's kind of like the interesting thing to me here is that we're talking about like vastly different tiers. But two players that are maybe similar in pedigree and expectation, Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence. These guys who can have these phenomenal top 3, top 5 QB1 overall weeks, and the floor can just fall completely out from under them, where there's weeks where Joe Burrow wasn't even in the top 24 quarterbacks, and we saw that plenty with Trevor Lawrence. So that's why I still kind of say, like, I think Trevor Lawrence becomes one of my favorite picks in a fantasy draft because I can draft him at quarterback 17, pair him with someone else. He's the last guy in this tier. And I think that the upside is there for him to potentially be in that quarterback 8, quarterback 7 range again, because there is that rushing upside. There is a guy that we know has the pedigree. And like you mentioned, there was the injury that was holding him back last year.
Mhm.
He was missing his favorite wide receiver in Christian Kirk. He was forcing. Then by the way, there were so many drops. Can we just acknowledge that for a second? All the
Yep.
drops that there were from Calvin Ridley and
Hey,
just
none
the
from Evan
offense in
Ingram.
general.
Evan Ingram was
Uh huh.
pretty sure-handed last year. Yeah,
Well,
that was nice
knock
to
on
see.
wood. Let's hope it keeps going through.
I think
Um,
the difference with Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence, though, trying to like compare those two guys, is just the situation that Joe Burrow was in, having Jamar Chase and T. Higgins,
Talent
and
around him is better.
yeah, and
There's no
you see,
doubt.
Joe Burrow in 2021 and 2022, he had 4,600 yards and 34 touchdowns. Followed that up with 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns. Where Trevor Lawrence has yet to get over the 25 touchdown mark, and his best season
Very
was
fair.
a shade over 4,100 passing yards. So we've already seen Joe Burrow kind of unlock that passing ceiling, and that's why he is up there. Where we're still like we know Trevor Lawrence can do it, but we just haven't seen it yet. So the potential is there. Like it wouldn't surprise me one bit if Trevor Lawrence comes out this year, throws for 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns, but we can't rank him as if he's done it until he
Right.
does it.
Right. And I think that's why I mean we're going to keep him at quarterback 17, and I don't foresee him moving up much higher in our rankings or jumping into a new tier. But that's why I like him so much for the potential that he has and the average draft cost that you can get him at. Let's jump into our next tier here, where this is where you start to see all the olds and the people with the most question marks. So at quarterback 18, we've got Matthew Stafford, Deshaun Watson at 19, Geno Smith at 20, 21 is Kirk Cousins, 22 Aaron Rodgers, 23 Baker Mayfield, and 24 Bryce Young. Welcome to the party, pal.
Hmm.
Uh Interesting that we both have him around there because he had one of the worst seasons by a rookie quarterback in recent NFL history.
But had one of the best off seasons a quarterback has had in a long time.
And I think that's where the projection comes in that he can't. And there's a lot there. We'll get into that in just a sec. There is this grouping here of Stafford, Watson, Geno, Cousins, and Rodgers that I think they're all very, very interchangeable. I think the reason that I will put Stafford higher on this list is because of the fact that he's got Cooper Cup and Puka Nakua. And I don't know that there's anyone on this list who has weapons that are as good. I think you could make the case that Geno has some very nice weapons in Seattle, but Jackson Smith-Jigba is, still developing. Tyler Lockett's getting a bit older. We really don't know what we have in Atlanta with Pitts and London, and we want to believe that there's incredible talent there. Cousins and Rodgers are both older guys coming off Achilles injuries. Both there's tons of potential there. It almost feels like Stafford becomes not only the safest, but the guy with the highest upside. I think you see it differently. I think you still see Deshaun Watson as the guy with the highest upside here, right?
Yeah, Deshaun Watson absolutely, in my opinion, has the most upside because like last year, we've talked about it a lot from like week 14 onward, where Matthew Stafford was supporting three wide receiver ones and a top three fantasy
That's
wide receiver
nuts.
or running
It's
back like
nuts.
Kyron Williams, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Demarcus Robinson. These guys were all smashing last year from week 14 onward, and Matthew Stafford was the per game QB9 over that stretch. Like he was getting outscored by Jake Browning and Derek Carr. So I think that's the concerning thing is just like having it's not even that he has no rushing upside. He has like negative rushing upside at this point in his career, like being 30 something years old and injury history. He just isn't going to run the ball whatsoever. So he can get the ball in his playmakers' hands, but this is a Rams team that we know likes to run the ball a lot as well. So, the passing volume might not be there. But even if it is like that, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Like even if the stars align, like we saw during the fantasy playoffs last year, he's still at best giving you like low end QB1 production. Where I think the difference with Deshaun Watson, if he reverts to the player that he was in years past and everything kind of aligns for him and he gets some of his rushing upside back and he stays healthy, we could be looking at a top 3 or a top 5 finish from Deshaun Watson. I don't think there's any world where Matthew Stafford has that ability.
I I get what you're saying and I respect it because theoretically what you're saying is right. I just don't see it with Watson anymore. Like
Oh yeah.
it's if he
Nobody
gets
does. I mean, I'm ranking him as QB 18. I'm not saying he's going
yeah,
to. I'm just
yeah.
saying it might happen. It could.
Yeah, there's a world.
There's a
There's a
world.
world. Uh I just don't see it with him anymore. He looks like a shell of his former self. And it's not even just that he looks like a shell of his former self, it's that we're asking him to do it with players that look also like shells of their former selves. With Elijah Moore, whose best season was his rookie year, and Jerry Judy, whose best seasons are behind him as well. At least we think maybe these guys all do put it together. This offense could be without Nick Chubb and could be forced to pass a bit more. Uh, it's a tough division with some really tough defenses and a guy who has the weight of the world on his shoulders there in Cleveland. So
So
I struggle with
the
it. I really do.
and I've brought this stat up a few times, but I just want to say it again. Last year, Deshaun Watson played 5 full games. One game he was horrendous. One game he was the QB 14. In 3 of the other games, 3 of the 5 games he played last year, 60% of the games that he played, he was still giving us top 10 quarterback production. So that's where I still find myself willing to go back to Deshaun Watson. He didn't look great, but he's a guy who has a little bit of rushing upside, especially near the goal line. He's surrounded by very good playmakers on what we expect to be a good offense. So, um, I don't know.
I'll say this.
Where he's getting drafted ADP wise, I'm drafting so much Deshaun Watson this year.
Yeah, and like, we're not going to get into the semantics of it because it's a quarterback that we're talking about as like quarterback 19 in our tiers and rankings list. But I will say this, like I'm looking at it right now, those games you're talking about, and he was quarterback 5 against Cincy when they had that crazy horrible week, and it's a 24-3 win. And then he's quarterback 10 against Tennessee, who was notoriously one of the worst secondaries in the league, and then Arizona, who was also a very bad secondary, quarterback 8. I I guess I want to know that he can do it against the good defenses as well, and knowing that he's going to have to go up against Pittsburgh and Baltimore multiple times a year. I'm I just like I don't know. Like I don't even know that I see the upside there of him being worth a draft pick. It's maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'm willing to be wrong on these things. And you kind of have to take swings. And I think that's more so where your mindset is coming. Is you have to take swings, especially when you're doing a lot of drafts, like you mentioned at the top of the show. Am I right?
Yes and no. I mean, like, even
Okay.
if I am just drafting in, like, my home league, like, I'm still willing to take a dart on Deshaun Watson as a QB2, and I'm like, I don't know. I know it
See,
sounds
like
crazy, but,
my
like,
dart would be Geno
last
if
year,
I'm going to do that.
if you take out the one game that he got injured last year and left early and scored negative zero point 0.8 points, if you take that one game out, he was in between Kyler Murray and CJ Stroud on a point per game basis. Like he would have been the QB 10 on a per game basis last year if you remove the one game that he left early with an injury. So and last year was bad. Like it was a bad year where things weren't going right and drop passes and missed throws and taking sacks and the mobility wasn't there and the arm strength wasn't there. Like I feel like last year was the worst case scenario for Deshaun Watson. And we still saw him as the per game QB 10 with 60% of his games inside the top 10. So yeah, it's a tough division. But I just am and again, it's all because of draft costs. Like if Deshaun Watson was getting drafted as a top 12 quarterback, I wouldn't have anything to do with him. But right now, in your home league draft with your buddies, you can draft Deshaun Watson in the very final round of your draft. Keep him stashed and see what happens. Maybe he can revert back to that guy who was a perennial top 5 quarterback when he was in Houston, or maybe he's just a pile of dust and you cut him from your roster after a few weeks. But that's the type of risk that I'm willing to take late in my drafts.
My guy that I'd rather be taking the risk on late in drafts is a quarterback 2 of some sorts if I'm not comfortable with my QB1 has been Geno Smith,
Yeah.
just because I think that offense takes such a phenomenal leap forward, and we've seen how good he can be. Um, Going back to 2022, if we're talking about a guy with top 5 upside, Geno, he was a top 5 quarterback then. So I think that everything, like you mentioned for Deshaun, everything was going wrong for the Browns last year and that offense in general, and it's kind of the same thing for Geno. So that's the guy that I'd rather go with. That's why I've got him ranked a little bit higher. Let's talk about these old quarterbacks that have some Achilles issues.
Eh,
Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins. There seems to be a lot of excitement about the players they're throwing to, but not excitement about them. Why are we doing that? Is this just like, do we get quarterback fatigue? Do we just love the fact that every quarterback is valuable now? Because we're doing this with Dak Prescott, with Jordan Love, with Brock Purdy, with Matt Stafford, with now Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers. We love their targets. We love their weapons. We're not too sold on them. Is it simply just because they're old and they're injured and we don't want to take that risk?
Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think
And
you
why do we
summed it
take the
up
risk
nicely
on
there.
their weapons? Like, well, we take the risk on their weapons at such a high draft cost, but then we're like,
I think if you just go
last
back
pick.
to
I don't really want Cousins.
Yeah, I think we just go back to kind of what I said last year. Like we're with Matthew Stafford, an old immobile quarterback, when he was sporting 3 wide receiver 1s and a top 3 running back, he was still, a back end QB1. And I think that's like if all the stars align for Aaron Rodgers and he has, a bounce back season, you're still probably looking at back
It's
end
being immobile.
QB1 production. Yeah, and I think it's just the lack of mobility there. And also what we like about those offenses, I think, is we can project very confidently where the targets are going to go. So it's not that we're expecting a 5,000 yard season from Aaron Rodgers. It's that we like Garrett Wilson and Brees Hall because we know they're going to get a ton of touches. We like Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and Bijan Robinson because we know they're going to get a ton of touches. I think it's more the delineation in these depth charts between like the very, very good players and everybody else. Like we're not expecting Aaron Rodgers to go out there and support Garrett Wilson and Brees Hall and Malachi Corley and Tyler Conklin. See what I did there?
Yeah, we did it.
We did it. But I think it's more that like we're excited about the high end playmakers on these offenses more than we are about the offenses as a whole.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I just wanted to get the conversation going. I do it for the content, Dave. I mean,
Yeah.
I have Cousins as my quarterback 21 and Rodgers as 22. Just put them back to back because they're old and they
Mhm.
have one Achilles each. All right, let's take a look at these last two guys. It's Baker Mayfield at 23, Bryce Young at 24, and I'm going to kind of gloss over Baker Mayfield because we both have him at quarterback 23, and I don't think there's anything surprising about where he's ranked. If anything, I think there's more concern this year than there was in the middle of the season last year because there is no Dave Canales there.
We
But
saw what happened to Geno Smith. Like Geno Smith lost Dave Canales and went from being a top 8 QB
yes,
to a back end QB2. And I think that's like if that happens with Baker Mayfield, let's just say hypothetically Baker Mayfield does kind of regress the same way Geno Smith did after this year, after losing Dave Canales. You got to imagine they're just like giving a blank check to Dave Canales in Carolina, right? Like if
yeah. Well, I
if
mean, it's going to
Baker
depend on what he
regresses
does with
and
Bryce
Bryce
Young.
takes a step forward, yeah, they're
Yeah.
just going to give him a blank check and say like, what do we have to do to keep you here for the next 20 years?
Yeah, and I think that's it. We've got Bryce Young here as our quarterback 24, and let's talk about this because he gets a much improved offensive line. He gets himself a high level rookie running back in Jonathan Brooks. He adds some weapons in the passing game in the draft with Xavier Legette and Jatavian Sanders, and I think most importantly, the Panthers add Deontay Johnson at wide receiver and Dave Canales as their head coach. And I think those are going to be the two moves that really lift up Bryce Young for fantasy managers. And I think if you're doing a super flex league, I think he becomes one of those perfect high upside, low draft cost QB2s. And Dave, we look at what Baker Mayfield did last year. This is a guy who was just perennially a quarterback 2 or worse. His career looked like it was over. Remember he was the backup for the Rams and he had to be
Mhm.
flown out on a plane
Do
and
you
learn the
remember Baker
playbook
Mayfield on the
overnight.
Panthers? Like, it's been a weird couple of years for Baker.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. Like it made
Yeah,
me choke up there. Yeah. No, I forgot that he was there.
yeah.
Uh Everything was just going wrong for him. And then all of a sudden he's quarterback 10. And it's not crazy to think that Bryce Young, another former number one pick, a guy who had very happy feet last year, just like Baker Mayfield did early in his career, struggled with the pass rush up the middle, struggled with being a smaller guy with the physical limitations. What happens in this world where all of a sudden Bryce Young magically becomes a top 15 or top 12 even fantasy quarterback? I don't know that the weapons are necessarily there for him in Carolina the way Baker had them in Tampa with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and Rashad White,
I mean,
but
Deontay and Leggett are no
yeah,
slouches.
I have my opinions on Leggett, but I do think that Deontay can be an absolute target hog for him. I think that Chris Harris, when he showed up on our podcast and talked about Adam Thielen, I know it's
Mhm.
the old husk of Adam Thielen, but like it's a very relevant player that can help Bryce Young. There's it's weird to say, but there's a real path where Bryce Young is all of a sudden a starting fantasy quarterback by the end of the season as things continue to progress.
Yeah, Bryce Young is a guy, like, at this point, we're probably getting a little too deep into the weeds for, like, your single quarterback redraft
Right.
leagues. Like, you're probably not drafting Bryce Young, but, like, in best ball, I've been drafting so much Bryce Young, like, just that high upside QB2. You don't have to worry about when to start him. He could have some spike weeks here and really pay off. So I find myself, like, in on Bryce Young, but the reality is, like, in your home league, redraft league, if Bryce Young does break out, you could probably just pick him up off of waivers. Like, he's not getting drafted in a ton of leagues, but the upside is undeniable. Like I said, like, he's had a great offseason. Dave Canales, Deontay Johnson, Xavier Leggett, Jonathan Brooks, Jatavian Sanders, like, they've done a lot in Carolina. And that doesn't even mention the offensive line, where they added two guards in free agency that should help them out as well. So it's just like night and day difference. And it kind of reminds me of Trevor Lawrence. Remember Trevor Lawrence had that year one with Doug Peterson and no weapons,
With
and
Urban Meyer.
everybody. Oh, that's right. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, Urban
Yes. How could
Meyer.
you forget?
That's right, when Urban Meyer was kicking the kickers down in Jacksonville, yeah, and, I'll
The tool.
not talk about what he was doing on college campuses,
Hey
but
now.
yeah, like, it was just a crazy year, for Trevor Lawrence in year 1, and then year 2, all of a sudden, they bring in Doug Peterson and give him some weapons, and then it's like, "Oh, wait, maybe Trevor Lawrence isn't a bust." I could totally see that same thing happening for Bryce Young. I just don't know if he's going to take such a step forward that we're ever talking about him as, like, a starter in a 10 or 12 team fantasy league, at least this year.
Yeah, maybe not. I can absolutely see him being the guy that he goes out, has a good week 1, follows it up with another good week 2, and all of a sudden the people that have a quarterback injury or just the quarterback that's underperforming from their draft go out and they're picking up Bryce Young to all of a sudden be their starting quarterback, especially the
Which is
teams that
exactly
already
what
have
happened with
Deontay.
Baker last year. Like, nobody drafted Baker, and then halfway through the season, everyone's like, "Wait, Baker Mayfield is the QB 10? Well, I'm gonna
Yep.
pick this guy up and start streaming him," and it kinda worked out.
Yep. Well, there you have it, guys. We went through 24 quarterbacks. This was a long one, but we went through our rankings and tiers for quarterbacks. We're going to continue doing the same thing here on rankings week with our running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. We got a lot more coming for you guys. We'll update these again once again in August, right before fantasy football drafts. It's not that far away, Dave. We're about a month and a half away from real football and the real season being played, the big fantasy draft weekend.
Coming
Not
up
too far
quick.
away. Yeah. Well, once again, I just thank you guys as always for watching and listening all the way through. I want to remind you guys, make sure you are subscribed not only to the channel, but to the Football Guys daily news updates where you get your emails and all the fantasy football information you need sent directly to your inbox by Joe Bryant, the man himself. For myself, for everyone at Football Guys, for Dave Kluge, I want to thank you guys for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Adios.